Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hi everyone, I've been in the kitchen again, this time to prepare a large Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, which I've not actually tasted yet, but it looks really good. And I've also baked a tray of mince pies filled with apples and chestnuts. Both these recipes can be found in Dinner with Dickens, written, or should I say penned, come on, it's Christmas, the season of bad puns, by today's guest, the wonderful award-winning food historian, Pen Vogler, who I'm thrilled to welcome back to the podcast. Today we're on a special mission where we focus on Dickens's 5 Christmas books, from A Christmas Carol to The Haunted Man, to see what the characters are eating and drinking in these stories, and perhaps more significantly, why? From the Cratchit children basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, Trotty and Meg sharing a dish of tripe outside on the steps, Edward and May's wedding, Dr. Jeddler's breakfast out in the orchard, and the Tetterby family's knucklebone of pork and pease pudding. Pen, happy Christmas and welcome back to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. It's so great to have you here again.
Thank you so much. I feel so Christmassy just being here.
Me too. So, Victorians and Christmas, what are the first things that spring to mind for you when you think about that?
Oh my goodness, such a massive question, because my mind is full of images, rather like the big picture of the ghost in the Christmas Carol. But for so many people, Dickens is the first thing that springs to mind in a way, isn't it? You know, there's because we feel that kind of Dickens somehow kind of created this idea of Christmas. And then a lot of that is true. And it's obviously not just Dickens, it's obviously kind of this Victorian creation of Christmas, you know, the Christmas tree and Christmas cards and all the rest of it. But the thing about Dickens and food at Christmas is that he takes dishes that were sort of generally sort of celebratory or generally kind of Christmassy, New Year's-y, whatever it is, and he really anchors them to Christmas Day in A Christmas Carol. And it's an extraordinary, unintended achievement. And so for me, what springs to mind when you say, Victorian Christmas, it really is that date when Christmas starts to become, a Christmas dinner rather, or lunch, whatever you call it, starts to become not the goose, because that's what you have if you're poor, the turkey, that's what the Reformed Scrooge brings to the Cratchit family, and the Christmas pudding. Before A Christmas Carol, the Christmas pudding is just called plum pudding. And that's what Dickens calls it. But afterwards, it starts to become Christmas pudding. It gets anchored to that one particular day.
Gosh, that's so interesting. And you mentioning the goose and the turkey straight away, that's absolutely right, because Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present, they watch the Cratchits have a Christmas dinner, don't they, of a tiny goose.
A
small atom of bone upon a dish.
Yes, exactly.
And then the turkey is, it's a little bit unsettling, but it's described as being so large that it could never walk in its life.
Yes.
So it's obviously been horribly overfed. And is it right that then the turkey then, as you said,
essentially replaces the goose? In many ways it does. And it's not just through Dickens, it's also to do with, agriculture and farming and the way that kind of birds were more intensively farmed or otherwise, because geese don't lend themselves to intensive farming in quite the same way that to some degree turkeys and chickens do. I don't mean that the birds want to be intensively farmed, because obviously that's ridiculous. But geese had a very, very kind of strong sort of presence in poorer Christmases for centuries. Geese were birds of the common. They lived on commons. People could own one or two. They didn't need anywhere to keep them. And then that idea that you have a goose at Christmas stays with you, even when people start moving to the cities, and you have what's called a goose club. And local people would pay into a goose club, probably kept by a publican. And at the end, it's like a Christmas club. And at the end, they get their goose. And so they know they're going to get some Christmas meat for themselves and their families. But what you can see in A Christmas Carol is that A turkey is becoming the thing to have for Christmas. It's much bigger, it's much meatier, it's much more expensive. If you look at Mrs. Beeton, who gives you prices for everything that she puts in, the turkey ends up being possibly almost twice as much for eater as a goose is. And it's much more lavish, it's much more middle class, and it becomes starts to become the icon of Christmas for sort of everybody. Dating from, so I'm not saying Dickens, it's just Dickens doing it, but definitely it's dating from that decade.
Wow. And that's obviously contrasted by earlier, if we look at A Christmas Carol, early in A Christmas Carol, Scrooge has a cold in his head and he sits down by the fire before Marley appears stirring some gruel.
Oh, gruel, yes.
I mean, what are your personal feelings about gruel? I've not tried it, I don't think. I mean, what actually is it, in fact?
What is it? It's just... Well, it's a very interesting question because there are so many different recipes for gruel and they're all slightly different. It's possibly one of two things. Very, very thin porridge. So if you make porridge with, I think I saw one recipe that said porridge is 5 ounces of oatmeal and a pint of water. Gruel is 2 ounces of oatmeal and a pint of water. But it might also be the sort of, you might actually also strain it to get the goodness out. And that's essentially oat milk. So we still like gruel.
Yes, I like oat milk. Yep.
We just call it oat milk. We want the goodness of oats. We call it a different thing. So gruel can be a few different things. And some early recipes for gruel, before it starts to get this, terrible association of the workhouse and kind of the abused, underfed child, some recipes for gruel were quite nice sounding. They had wine and they had sugar and they had butter and they might have some herbs or some spices in them. But the workhouse is not good for the image of gruel.
Maybe I don't mind gruel after all. Then.
Well, it depends whether you like oat milk or not.
I do. I mean, I tend to have porridge for breakfast. Most days.
Yeah, it's gruel adjacent,
It is pretty close, isn't it? It's pretty close. But it's just understanding what the hell Scrooge is doing, because he's had his melancholy dinner already in a melancholy tavern. And he goes home to bed, and as he's getting ready for bed, he's stirring some gruel, and he has a cold. So is there any sense that that's kind of like having a hot, milky drink before bed?
Oh, yes, definitely. For kind of, if you look at Mr. Woodhouse in Emma, for example, in Emma by Jane Austen, Mr. Woodhouse is a real valetudinarian. He's always got something wrong with him. He can't eat this and he can't eat that, and it's a little bit too cold, and, sit closer to the fire and blah, blah, blah. And his favourite dish to be settled is a basin of gruel. And so you can see that feat going right up to Scrooge as well, obviously, who probably shares some of those kind of much earlier kind of Georgian ideas of, a kind of nice, plain, unthreatening, non-stimulating dish.
Yes.
Gruel is all those things.
Gosh, and you saying this for the first time makes me connect with Marley when he sees Marley for the first time, says, "You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato." So there's a sense perhaps that the food he's been having isn't agree with him, his general distemper.
Yes.
Body and spirit.
Exactly. This idea you shouldn't eat cheese at night because it gives you nightmares. Yes. So it's this idea that everything that's happening to him spiritually, he's trying to locate in the physical body. He's trying to kind of rationalize it all.
Yes. Yes. And at one point he says, "If I swallow this toothpick, are you saying I'm going to be haunted by goblins for eternity?" Yes, if he chokes on a toothpick. Yeah, that's so clever. Just to be able to extract these details is so fun. It's so fascinating. And of course, at the end of the story, when Scrooge is feeling charitable and loving Christmas, and he says to Bob Cratchit about making some smoking bishop, which I'm holding in my hand here because I followed your recipe from Dinner with Dickens and made some which I've never had before.
Pretty nice.
I'll take a sip and then ask you to explain what the hell I just drunk.
Take a sip. Tell me if you like it, and then I'll tell you what's in it.
Oh, you know what? I do like that.
Yeah, it's pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah, it is actually really, It doesn't sound great.
No, it's essentially, people get it confused with Stinking Bishop, the cheese, but it is Smoking Bishop.
Right.
And it's mulled port. So it's all the things that we love about mulled wine or glühwein or whatever you want to call it, but it's with port. And so you get that kind of extra layer of kind of richness and body, that you get with port rather than wine. It's already quite sort of lush, really. And it's sort of simmered very gently with the same things, with orange, lemon, spices, cinnamon, sugar, all the rest of it. And I make it actually, and I sort of water it down a bit with blackcurrant juice because it's quite strong, hot blackcurrant. And sometimes I make it into jellies for Christmas.
Oh,
so
really?
It's like the taste of Christmas there in a jelly.
Yeah.
You just put, just set it with a little bit of gelatin. It's really beautiful.
Oh, great. And following your recipe, I took a decision to not do, I think, the 2 tablespoons of sugar. I went for just 1, and I quite like that it's not too...
Yes.
And I put lemon juice, so you had a choice of lemon juice or orange juice, and I went for the lemon juice.
Yes, port and lemon, a very old Victorian kind of cocktail, really, isn't it?
So, yeah, I'm going to say that's gone straight to my head, and the future for Bob is looking really bright. I probably shouldn't have drunk it so early in the episode. Yes, wonderful.
So the fascinating thing about Smoking Bishop is that it's a status drink. So Scrooge, who's been trying to keep Bob poor and kind of under his heel, when he's reformed, he invites him to come around for Smoking Bishop, and it's port, not just wine or ale, or, it's your working class man would have ale or possibly cider, but he's giving him something that a gentleman would give to another gentleman. And that's quite a statement about his new image of his relationship with Bob Cratchit.
And his intention, that's amazing.
And his intention, yeah.
Yeah. Gosh. So that was in 1843, the year Christmas began.
Yes, ish. Yes.
And then in 1844, the following year, we have the Chimes. And one of the first moments when we're introduced to that central character of Trotty is the clock strikes midday and Trotty says, dinner time. So straight away, that throws up something interesting about what we think dinner is. What's happened to dinner over the years?
It's really interesting that Trotty says dinner time, because probably 10 or 20 or 30 years later, he wouldn't. He would probably, if he's in London, he would probably say lunchtime. But he's there at that kind of moment when dinner is still the thing that most people eat in the middle of the day. And this, if you go back to Pepys has dinner at 12 o'clock. If you go back earlier, if you go back to Henry one of those Shakespeare plays, can't remember which.
Somebody it could be has 4th, 5th, 6th, or 8th, couldn't it?
Yeah, somebody has dinner at around 10 o'clock in the morning. You get up early, you have your breakfast, you have your dinner, and then you have supper. And then what happens over those centuries, the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, is that dinner gets later and later and later. And the Victorians, who were obsessive about kind of status and kind of society and having an elite, the elite wanted to show that they were different from the rest of society by having dinner later. And so it gets driven into the kind of evening. By the end of the Victorian period, people are having dinner at about 8 o'clock. And then, of course, people get hungry. And so this thing called lunch gets invented, more or less. Samuel Johnson mentions it, but doesn't really know where the word comes from. He puts it in his dictionary. Jane Austen mentions it kind of once in her whole output. But by the Chimes, lunch is starting to become a thing that sort of the middle classes and the kind of elite have. And then, of course, if lunch is sort of middle of the day and then dinner is 8 o'clock, you have to have this other thing called afternoon tea or something, to kind of plug all those gaps. I shouldn't think Dickens sits down and says to himself, shall I call this lunch or dinner or something? I'm sure it's completely unconscious. He's just putting his characters in that social situation at a time. Yes. And the words they use totally reflect everybody's assumptions about what you're going to eat, when you're going to eat it, and what you're going to call it.
Just picking up on what you're saying, because his daughter Meg refers to it as dinner as well. But I wonder whether it's a class thing as well, because they're both very, very poor, and sometimes they get one meal a day. Mm. And maybe if you're of that working class background or below the poverty line, your one meal you would just call dinner. Exactly
right. And we still have this thing in Britain where there's not just a class thing, but there's a regional thing. I grew up in Yorkshire and we had school dinners. That's just what you had. And that's what we called it. If you were from Scotland, if you're from Wales, I think probably. And I think some places in the Midlands still just say dinner in the middle of the day. And that probably does go back to the kind of class thing, the way you'd have your main meal in the middle of the day because you've been up early working and you weren't expecting a kind of big fancy meal in the evening. What you'd have in the evening would be your tea, and that would be called tea because literally it would be bread, cheese maybe, bacon or something, and a nice hot cup of tea. And the tea turns this kind of cold meal into a hot one, kind of conceptually, or kind of in your experience of it. So yes, those words are very class related. They're very regional, and they're very tight, and they change through time as well. It's quite difficult to explain to non-Brits what is dinner, what is lunch, and what is tea.
Yeah. And then moments later, and it's a real treat, it's a real occasion, his daughter Meg arrives and she has a basket, and in the basket is tripe and hot potato.
Yes. And he guesses. She makes him guess, doesn't she, what it is, because it smells so delicious. He can't believe his luck.
And it's utterly stomach churning, possibly, to most of us. But what is, I know what a hot potato is, but what is tripe?
Tripe is the lining of the stomach of a cow.
Okay.
And people used to love it.
Yeah.
And actually, it didn't have necessarily the same kind of low status connotations that we think of it today. Again, it's a slightly regional thing. It was a big Lancashire dish. People kind of laugh at tripe and say, tripe and onions. That's what you eat on, in Yorkshire, or up in actually Lancashire, not Yorkshire. I came across this very fascinating detail about fish and chip shops when fish and chip shops were advised to sell tripe because ladies, sort of lower middle class ladies, would be embarrassed to go to the fish and chip shop because that was kind of low status, but they wouldn't be embarrassed to be going to the tripe shop because that has higher status.
Wow.
It's just mind blowing, isn't it?
Yeah,
how things kind of change. Fish and chips have gone up and tripe right down over those kind of 200 years in terms of our kind of ideas of status and food.
That's so interesting. That is really interesting. And of course, so tripe has that status. But tripe, funnily in the story, becomes one of the potential causes of Trotty's then visitation by the goblins, because when he comes to, at the end of the story, his daughter says, Megan, whatever you do, father, don't eat tripe again.
That's probably good advice.
Yeah. So the idea is essentially, it's kind of half jokingly, but the idea is he's had this whole series of kind of life-threatening, terrifying dreams and illusions from eating tripe. I thought hot potato is interesting. The resonance of the word potato in the year 1845.
Oh, yes,
when we're
absolutely.
moving into, that's so interesting as well. I mean, how aware would Dickens have been by that point? Would you imagine, maybe not Dickens specifically, but Victorian society, London Victorian society, aware of the situation in Ireland?
Everybody knew about it.
Okay.
And it appears to me that nobody stopped eating potatoes. Nobody says, actually, maybe we shouldn't be importing food from Ireland. Maybe we should be sending food to Ireland. That's not quite true, but nobody thinks that you should stop eating potatoes. Queen Victoria said that to help the poor, starving people of Ireland, that we should have a day's fast, I think she said. And Dickens thought that was complete rot. He said that's complete nonsense. People don't just need a fast. They need some rather more pragmatic and material help. And there were people who helped pragmatically and materially. There was a really wonderful French chef who was the chef for the Reform Club in London. He took himself he's called Alexis Sawyer. He took himself to Ireland. He opened a kind of famine kitchen and in Dublin, tried to demonstrate how to feed a huge amount of people with kind of cheap soups and cheap sort of rice and lentils and that kind of thing. But it was an extraordinary time because the 40s were known as the hungry 40s anyway. It wasn't just, obviously the Irish famine was terrible, of a magnitude hugely greater than anything that we saw in other, industrial cities in Britain. But the government would have had a sense it's difficult when you have people who are hungry in Manchester or Liverpool or whatever. There's a sense that for the government it's hard to send food to Ireland. And the government kept on saying, right, it's an Irish problem. You've got to sort it out yourself. And there was also this very nasty sort of subcurrent in government that it's sort of, this is God's way of solving a problem. There's too many people in Ireland. There's overpopulated. God is just getting rid of the kind of weak ones. And with that idea at the heart of some kind of fairly kind of not everybody in government, some sort of evangelical Christian people in government, it was, it's just not a very, it's not a very kind of sound basis on which to base a policy to try and save people, really.
Yeah, of course.
We talk a lot about how, and Dickens talks a lot about how food brings people together. And that's often the purpose of food in Dickens and in our lives. And famine for Dickens was a very isolating, very individual experience, not famine, but hunger for him as a child. It made him feel like he was not part of a family. He was not being looked after. He was not loved. But there is also this sense of not starving, but of fasting, where actually it can unite people, so this idea of Lent, or kind of you give something up and it says something about what you as a community are prepared to give up to kind of represent whatever you believe in. And I think there is something to fasting that we have lost. We've kept all the hot cross buns and the turkey and the great food. But in Britain particularly, and not every community, because I think often you get, Jewish and Hindu and Sikh and other kind of religious communities still have fasting as part of their, their kind of daily lives. And we do seem to have lost some of that.
Yes.
So I think there's something to be said for fasting, but like you say, it also needs systemic change.
Yeah. So further on into the story, Trotty meets a man, Will Fern, and a little girl, and they've got nowhere to stay, and he brings them in, and he spends his last... I can't remember the exact amount he spends, but he spends his last money to get some bacon. He brings them to his house, gets some bacon for them. He sizzles the bacon, and he makes lots of cups of tea. On the opposite side, you have the MP, Sir Joseph Vogler, who, the snobby MP, toasting the poor every New Year's Eve. I am the poor man's friend. Every year. Yeah, he's awful. He is, who believes he's very virtuous and is a friend of the poor. I am the poor man's friend, because he toasts them every New Year's Eve. That's it. That's all you need to do. There's the gesturing again, isn't there? You can hug yourself with really cozy kind of notions, but then without actually going out and doing anything to beyond that. So that's the Chimes. If we move on to the Cricket on the Hearth, it's absolutely dominated by this bloody kettle that won't go on for ages and ages. Dickens is obsessed with the racing kettle, and it eventually boils itself over. And I think the characters drink a lot of tea. So the idea of tea drinking, for some reason, in my mind, I associated it as more recent than Dickens. I don't know why. More kind of Edwardian, Jeeves, that kind of period. But obviously tea drinking goes way back. Oh,
there's tea throughout Dickens. I had a theory. Let's not call it a theory. Let's call it an observation that the bad characters in Dickens drink coffee. Right. I think Uriah Heep drinks coffee, and Quilp drinks scalding hot coffee, I think. And the good characters drink tea. Anyway, small observation. There are probably lots and lots of counterexamples. So there's tea throughout Dickens, and his characters love a good cup of tea. And I think, again, it situates it very much in that sort of lower middle class place where inviting somebody over for tea, which might be a bacon sandwich, it might be a tea and a cake, piece of cake. It often has ham, bread and butter, some eggs or something. That's a very safe, very nice way of entertaining people. And that happens quite a lot through Dickens, because those kind of middle-class characters, they, on the whole, can't put on big, posh dinners because they don't have the resources to do it. But to entertain each other, tea is often the way they do it. And also tea is safe. There's no alcohol. It means that, men and women can all kind of sit round, and children can all sit round and drink together. And there isn't a kind of a division between sort of who's drinking and who's eating what.
Oh, that's interesting. And then further into the story, we've got a leg of mutton, which I think you said in the previous episode is a favourite of Dickens. They don't mention oysters stuffed into it.
Well,
but
anyway,
mutton
they're missing out.
Mutton is, I can't think of when I've ever had mutton, actually, which seems a bit odd, doesn't it?
You probably haven't. So mutton was the meat of the 18th and 19th century. So going back to Jane Austen, she, one of her characters in Emma says to another, you must come round and eat your mutton with us. And it basically just means You're coming for dinner, of course you're going to have mutton, because that's what everybody has. And mutton is technically a sheep that's older than 2 years of age. And around 2 years of age, it's called a hogget, and around 1 year of age, it's called a lamb. And these days, we really just have lamb, mostly, because sheep farming has changed. Sheep get bigger and fatter much earlier. And so by the time they're whatever age it is, 1 year or 18 months, they're fat enough to be killed for meat. And so you can get mutton, but it tends to not be called mutton. So sometimes you get it in Indian restaurants and they call it lamb rogan josh or something. That might be mutton. I last had it, I think, in a Hungarian restaurant, mutton and something or other. But it was very much the kind of the meat of the time, and everybody ate it. It was, more or less available. I mean, bacon and pig meats were the really cheap meats that were much more available to everybody. But the things that you might see the expression butcher's meat in novels, Victorian novels, and that's what they mean. They mean red meat that comes from a butcher, and that means mutton or occasionally beef.
And a veal and ham pie. Is that a familiar Victorian staple?
That's also a familiar Victorian staple, because veal is the meat of a calf, not something we're very keen on now, fortunately, I would say. It could be quite dry, not much fat to it, and so you'd pack it in a pie with ham, which has got a lot of fat in it, and so the ham would sort of, the fat of the ham and the salt of the ham would kind of give it the taste. But a veal and ham pie is a very classic kind of Georgian and Victorian and even Edwardian thing.
Have you had it yourself?
I've made veal and ham pie. Yes. Yeah. You get it in up north. You get it in the miners' galas, and there's a thing called a gala pie, which can also be a veal and ham pie, and it might have a boiled egg, like running through it.
That sounds really nice. I'm a big fan of pies. Good. And then rolling on to the battle of life, it opens with two sisters dancing in an orchard, and there's a lot of talk about that, and they're picking apples and everything. And it made me think, and I'm sure I read this somewhere, that the species of apples have really declined in number since that time. So we don't have as many types of apple in the UK that we would have done maybe 150 odd years ago. I
think that's true. And I think apples were much more regional in those days, because there are some apples that will grow in different conditions. They were much more local. And apples have been bred extraordinarily successfully to be quite homogenous. They might be called Pink Lady or Jazz or something, and you probably can't tell the difference between them because they're crisp and they're white flesh and they're sweet and they're juicy. And, they're delicious, but, we've lost some of and those varieties, most of them haven't disappeared. They are kind of kept in sort of, horticultural sort of museums. So, well, they're not museums, but kind of the seeds and the plants are kept, but we don't tend to see them in supermarkets anymore.
And then they all sit down to have breakfast outside. It sounds lovely until they decide to have a carved round of beef and ham for breakfast.
Totally normal.
Totally normal. Okay.
What year? So what year are we looking at?
This is 1846.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably still quite normal. I mean, breakfast wasn't the kind of the country house breakfast that we think of now until probably much, much later, late Victorian, early Edwardian. This idea that you'd have, eggs and bacon and, and a round of ham and kippers and porridge and cream and 10 different types of breads and all the rest of it. That was much later. That was a kind of invented much later. But this idea that you'd have breakfast tended to be just what you had around, and if you had a round of beef and a round of ham, that's what you'd have.
Cold meats then, essentially, that you would...
Cold meats is very normal. Yeah. But you might have radish, Pepys has radishes for breakfast he records in one of his diaries. And Henry VIII, there's a kind of little kind of household book kept by Henry VIII's household, and it records Catherine Parr's waiting ladies being given a chine of beef and beer for breakfast. That was their kind of rations, Gosh. So beef and beer for breakfast, totally normal.
And in continental Europe, actually, you have meats served out, don't you? For breakfast, you have hams and things like that, in the breakfast bars. And,
yeah.
Okay. And then moving into that final story, that very, very bleak, dark, haunted man story. What's actually being served is fowl and mashed potato with a butter boat of gravy, a buttered side dish of gravy. In terms of status and in terms of quality, what would this be like, do you think?
It's really interesting. It comes up so often in Dickens. A roast fowl is his sort of image of sort of posh comfort food in a funny sort of way. So many of his so many of his characters make it. You have lovely Bella Wilfer, and she's trying to roast a fowl for cherubic pa, and she twirls it so quickly it's raw in the middle. And she says to him, "Is it the breed, pa?" And he says, "No, I think we need to kind of cook it because it's kind of pink in the middle." But yes, and of course, in the Great Expectations, Pip's sister's Christmas dinner, or they have a nice pair of roast fowls. We would just call it roast chicken, but so for some reason that phrase has changed since Dickens' times. Dickens always calls it roast fowl.
And the mashed potato, anything specific from that time in 1848? Would you do mashed potato any differently to now?
Well, it's so interesting. In Dickens's wife's recipe book or menu book called What Should We Have for Dinner, so many of her menus include what she calls mashed and browned potatoes. And I was really fascinated by this. I wondered what it meant. And essentially what it is you mash your potato and then you sort of you could cover it with egg or butter or a bit of both, and then you brown it in front of a hot fire. And my goodness, the result is extraordinary. It's like sort of a roast potato on steroids. It's so hot and crispy on the outside and fluffy in the middle and totally delicious. And we seem to have lost the kind of roasted mashed and brown potatoes. And it sounds so grim, mashed and brown potatoes. It sounds really kind of sort of workhouse food. And actually it turns out to be incredibly delicious.
Gosh, that's so interesting because I love mashed potato, but I feel like we've been getting it wrong my whole life, missing out on the 1840s way of preparing it.
So what I do when I make it is I kind of get an ice cream, I make my mashed potato, I get an ice cream scoop and I get kind of little rounds of mashed potato, and then, you paint them with with egg or butter, put them in a hot oven, and you get this lovely kind of brown outside and hot fluffy middle. It's great.
I mean, the bleakness of the scene in this book made me assume that this wasn't a very enjoyable meal to eat, but it turns out that that's actually probably the opposite, that actually the fowl and mashed potato served there is actually really quite delicious.
I'd have it. Yeah.
I think I might have it.
Yeah. I'd be pretty happy to tuck into it now.
So moving on through the story, another point then is when we get to the Tetterby family, and the Tetterbys are kind of like the Cratchits. And certainly in terms of poverty, and there's a fascinating thing where they've brought a knucklebone of pork. Was that a standard phrase to describe a meal that you would have got?
Well, I think it's not an entire meal because the knucklebone, I mean, they talk about it. Dickens kind of describes the knucklebone in the book, doesn't he, as not having that much meat left upon it.
Yeah.
And it's quite a big, bony, slightly fatty joint. But bones, the bone in a joint is really essential to give the rest of the joint all its flavour. So there will be some kind of nice, delicious bits in there. And often you'd cook knuckle bones with something like peas to make peas pudding.
Yeah.
And I think that's another dish that he has, doesn't it? With the Tetterbys, they have kind of knucklebone of pork with not that much meat on it, and peas pudding, which should have been cooked with the pork, although seems to be a question mark over this one about whether it has or not.
Yes, and there's no stint of seasoning, which I find interesting because, if you're trying meat alternatives, for example, I had some bacon yesterday, which I liked very much because the flavour is so good. And you think, oh, well, I've got it. Yeah,
okay.
But actually you can get round. So when he says here, Dickens says but there was no stint of seasoning. So however spare it was in terms of meat, the taste and the flavour was still there.
Well, that's probably because it might be fresh pork, but it also might be pickled or salted pork. So again, if you go back to the Great Expectations at Christmas feast, he has a leg of pickled pork. And pickled, it sounds as though you mean vinegar, but actually in that respect, it means salted. And you could pickle pork, you could salt pork, either with sort of dry salt or with a kind of a wet brine. and you put all your flavours into it. And that's probably what the Garges had, but it does mean it's quite salty. And so one of the reasons you have peas pudding with pork all the time is that both can take quite a lot of boiling, and the dried peas, absorb all the flavour and the salt from the pork. And so if you have too much salt in the pork, the peas help to sort of absorb it, and you get the flavour of the pork and the salt into the peas pudding. And that's why you have pea and ham soup. That's why they were cooked together for so many centuries, because it's just to try and kind of, when meat has been salted you might be keeping it for weeks or months. That's how you cook it, to kind of get rid of some of that saltiness.
Wow. And there's one other clue, Pen, which is that one of the Tetterby children, it's Johnny, I think, he receives his rations on bread, which gives us a clue as to if we're in any doubt about how meagre their portion of all of this is.
I guess he's probably getting the peas pudding just spread on bread, a bit like hummus, I suppose, chickpeas and hummus. Do you know what I mean? It's not that far apart. So it's probably quite nutritious, but not that much for a growing boy.
No. I had, last of all, to show you, Pen, I attempted the mince pie recipe that is in with your dinner with Dickens book. So if I just show you the mince pie, this is my attempt.
Oh, very good. It's got a little star on the top.
Yes, I'm a bit worried. I wonder whether I made the pastry a bit too thick. So if I take a taste, I'll maybe you could talk us through this little recipe. As
you eat your delicious mince pie.
Let me give it. I'm sorry.
I'm sitting here.
Yeah, while you.
I'm sitting here with no envy at all. So mince pies were called Christmas pies quite often. Mm-hmm. They have a very, very long history in Britain. There's a very famous kind of story with a kernel of truth to it, that the Puritans tried to ban them, and the Puritans definitely disapproved of them. The Puritans definitely thought that the mince pie was a waste of poor people's money, and they should be spending their money not on these kind of delights for the belly, but on sort of useful things. And they wanted people to stop eating them. They didn't technically ban them, but they've always been associated with Christmas, and it's early mince pies, and they're called mince pies because they've had minced meat in, and we don't have that any longer. That comes from a very early kind of medieval sense of how you prepare meat, because in medieval times, grand food was always made with spices. So you wouldn't have had anything that didn't have some kind of cinnamon or nutmeg or, other kind of different kinds of spices, and sugar, used in very tiny amounts as a spice, and meat. And so those tastes stay in some of our food. Things like bread sauce, that's made with cloves and all the rest of it. They come from that period. And so the mince pie is this kind of spiced meat, and the meat kind of goes, but we still sort of have it in suet. You need some kind of fat to make it luscious, whether it's suet or vegetarian suet.
Yes, I've got vegetarian suet in this one. Yeah.
Suet is actually probably nicer, but I totally get that not everybody wants to eat it.
I really like this, though. There's a lightness to it as well. It's got chestnut and apple.
It's got chestnuts. Yeah, I think that recipe came from Scotland. Actually, I think I found that in the National Library of Scotland's archives, because there are loads of recipes for mincemeat. Eliza Acton has them. They go way back. And I was trying to find something that was ever so slightly different, because you can get a recipe for Victorian mincemeat anywhere. And I really like the chestnuts. I think it does make it a little bit lighter.
Yes, great. And actually the pastry wasn't too thick. I got that right with the lid, because sometimes you don't have the lids on, do you? You just have a little decoration.
Paul Hollywood would be proud of you.
Oh, it's been so great to have you back again, Pen. Thank you so much for this.
Well, thank you so much. Anyway, I feel very hungry.
I'm so sorry. Yes, for the listeners, we're not in the same room, so I'm eating all the food and drinking all the smoking bishop. What are you going to have this Christmas to eat? Have you got in mind what you think you'd like to have?
Oh goodness, I do like doing something slightly different. Not. It definitely won't be a turkey, but it'll be a very small, maybe some duck or something. Small amount of meat. That's a kind of special treat, because we're trying to eat a lot less meat. But yeah, all the stuff. I just love all the stuff. I love the Brussels sprouts. I love the bread sauce. You know, I love the kind of little bacon rolls and everything, and the stuffing.
Yeah, the stuffing's great, isn't it?
Yeah, the stuffing, all that. Love the Christmas pudding.
Yes. Oh, definitely. Yes.
So all of it, basically. That's what I'm having.
Wonderful. Good. Oh, well, thank you so much. And people listening, if you want to buy Dinner with Dickens, it's in the link wherever you're listening. And of course, Stuffed, which came out in November, which I thoroughly recommend. It takes you all the way through food history in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much, Pen, and a very Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you. And Happy Christmas to you.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much and see you next time.